December 20th, 1944. Luxembourg City. Winter had settled over the Ardennes like a clenched fist. Snow choked the roads, visibility collapsed, and the largest German offensive in the west since Normandy was tearing open the Allied front. Inside a dimly lit headquarters, a single telephone call cut through the chaos. General Omar Bradley, commander of the American 12th Army Group, stood gripping a black bakelite receiver so tightly that his knuckles had turned pale. On the other end of the line was Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander in Europe. Eisenhower's voice was controlled, careful, and already weighed down by the implications of what he was about to say. Two American armies, the 1st and the 9th, were being placed under British command. Temporarily, operationally, under Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. For Bradley, the words landed like a blow to the chest. For more than 2 years, American forces had expanded from a junior partner in North Africa into the dominant military power on the European continent. By December 1944, American divisions outnumbered British formations by a wide margin. American industry sustained the Allied war effort. American logistics fed, fueled, and armed nearly every offensive in Western Europe. Yet in this moment of crisis, Eisenhower was transferring command of 2 American armies to a British officer whose relationship with American commanders had been poisoned by years of resentment. Bradley erupted. "By God, Ike, I cannot be responsible to the American people if you do this. I resign." The outburst was uncharacteristic. Bradley was known for restraint, for understatement, for suppressing emotion in favor of discipline. But this decision struck at something deeper than military hierarchy. It cut into questions of national authority, political legitimacy, and personal dignity. Eisenhower's reply was cold, precise, and final. "Brad, I, not you, am responsible to the American people. Your resignation therefore means absolutely nothing." There was a pause. Bradley protested once more, briefly, then fell silent. The call ended. Outside, the war continued. Inside Allied headquarters, something far more dangerous had surfaced. This moment, buried amid the emergency of the Battle of the Bulge, crystallized 3 years of mounting American frustration with a single man. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. To the British public, Montgomery was a savior, the victor of El Alamein, the general who had restored British confidence after a string of humiliating defeats. To Winston Churchill, he was indispensable. To British soldiers, he was a commander who planned meticulously and avoided unnecessary slaughter. To many American commanders, he was something else entirely. He was the embodiment of an assumption they found intolerable: that British judgment was inherently superior, that American forces required supervision, and that decisive victory could only come under British intellectual leadership, even after the balance of power had shifted decisively toward the United States. This was not a conflict born of a single insult or a single decision. It was the result of an accumulation of slights, of dismissals, of public claims and private condescension that stretched back to the sands of North Africa and followed the Allied armies into Sicily, France, and finally Germany itself. The question that haunted American headquarters from Tunisia to Luxembourg was not whether Montgomery was competent. His record proved that he was. The question was why a coalition fighting for survival against Nazi Germany found itself repeatedly divided, not by enemy action, but by the personality and assumptions of one of its most prominent commanders. The mathematics of Allied command were deceptively simple, yet politically explosive. By late 1944, American forces formed the overwhelming majority of Allied combat power in Western Europe. The United States fielded over 60 divisions on the continent. Britain and Canada together contributed fewer than 20. American factories produced aircraft, tanks, trucks, ammunition, and fuel in quantities that no European power could match. American shipping sustained the entire logistical backbone of the Allied advance. Yet Montgomery behaved as though these realities were temporary inconveniences rather than irreversible facts. To American eyes, he represented a worldview they believed they had rejected nearly 2 centuries earlier. Aristocratic presumption, imperial condescension, and an unshakable belief that leadership flowed naturally from British tradition rather than contemporary power. His manner suggested not partnership, but tutelage, not collaboration, but instruction. And yet, Montgomery was no cartoon villain. He was intellectually formidable, deeply committed to preparation, and obsessed with reducing casualties. His insistence on overwhelming force before engagement saved British lives at a time when Britain could not afford to lose them. After the disasters of 1940 and 1941, British soldiers needed a commander who would win, and Montgomery delivered victories. Churchill adored him. The British press celebrated him. His troops trusted him. None of this mitigated the growing anger among American officers who found themselves repeatedly sidelined, publicly diminished, and privately patronized by a man who seemed unable or unwilling to acknowledge that American commanders might be his equals. The friction did not begin with grand strategic debates or clashing doctrines. It began with something far more personal: respect. From their first encounters in North Africa, American commanders sensed that Montgomery's assessment of them was already formed. They were energetic, well-equipped, and enthusiastic, but inexperienced. Useful, but not decisive. Brave, but not yet sophisticated. In Montgomery's worldview, Americans were still learning the craft of war that Britain had practiced for centuries. That assumption would shape every interaction that followed. The roots of this conflict lay deep in history. Britain entered the Second World War with a professional officer corps steeped in imperial tradition. Command was centralized, hierarchical, and socially stratified. Many senior British officers were products of elite institutions, trained to see themselves as custodians of a global system built over generations. The American Army was something else entirely. In 1940, it was small, underfunded, and inexperienced. Its rapid expansion transformed it into a mass force led by officers who had risen through merit, not pedigree. American commanders valued initiative, speed, and adaptability. They were comfortable with risk, in part because their nation's industrial base could replace losses at a scale Britain could not. These cultural differences were manageable, until Montgomery's personality turned them into fault lines. He spoke publicly with certainty bordering on dogma. He tolerated dissent poorly. He viewed alternative approaches not as competing ideas, but as threats to clarity and control. To those who shared his assumptions, this was confidence. To Americans, it felt like arrogance. The crisis of December 1944 exposed the full weight of that tension. The German offensive in the Ardennes had forced Eisenhower to prioritize unity over pride. Transferring command to Montgomery made operational sense in the moment. British forces were positioned to secure the Meuse crossings. Montgomery's headquarters was intact. American units in the north were disorganized and under severe pressure. But the fury of Bradley's reaction revealed that the problem was not the decision itself. It was the man receiving the authority. Bradley had fought alongside Montgomery long enough to understand what this transfer symbolized. It was not merely a temporary wartime expedient. It was confirmation, in Bradley's mind, that Montgomery still viewed American forces as instruments to be directed, not partners to be consulted. That assumption, that British judgment must guide American strength, had survived every battlefield reversal, every shift in manpower, and every transformation of the alliance. It was an assumption forged in North Africa, reinforced in Sicily, challenged in France, and finally exposed under the snow of the Ardennes. And it would not survive the war. What followed would be a story not of incompetence, but of incompatibility. Not of failure in battle, but failure in coalition leadership. Montgomery's military talents were real. His victories were documented. His caution saved lives. But war among allies requires more than skill. It requires recognition of changing realities. It requires humility. It requires the ability to share credit as readily as responsibility. Montgomery possessed many virtues. That ability was not among them. The Americans would learn this lesson slowly, painfully, and at moments when unity mattered most. The consequences would shape not only the remainder of the Second World War, but the future of coalition warfare itself. Bernard Law Montgomery did not emerge in isolation. He was not simply an individual personality imposing himself on a coalition by force of ego alone. He was the product and the beneficiary of a system that had been forged over centuries and hardened by catastrophe. To understand why Montgomery behaved as he did, and why his conduct proved so corrosive to Allied unity, one must understand the institutional, cultural, and psychological framework that sustained him long before American soldiers ever set foot on European soil. Britain entered the Second World War as an empire in decline, but not yet in denial. In 1939, the British Army was small, professional, and globally dispersed. Its officer corps was drawn disproportionately from elite social strata, educated in institutions that emphasized continuity, hierarchy, and tradition. Command was not merely a function of competence, it was an expression of inherited authority. The British Army had been policing empire for generations. It believed deeply and sincerely that it understood war at a level others did not. The disasters of 1940 shattered British confidence, but they did not erase British assumptions. The fall of France, the evacuation at Dunkirk, and the long, grinding humiliation of retreat across North Africa forced Britain to confront its own vulnerability. It had lost material, prestige, and strategic initiative. What it had not lost was its belief in professional superiority. Out of this crucible emerged Montgomery. When Bernard Montgomery assumed command of 8th Army in August 1942, Britain was desperate for a figure who could reverse the narrative of defeat. Montgomery understood this moment instinctively. He reorganized the army, purged commanders he deemed inadequate, simplified plans, and, most importantly, refused to attack until conditions favored success. At El Alamein, Montgomery delivered exactly what Britain needed: a clear, unmistakable victory against German forces that had humiliated British arms for 2 years. He fought methodically. He used overwhelming firepower. He avoided unnecessary risk. The result was not merely tactical success, it was psychological restoration. From that moment on, Montgomery became more than a general. He became a symbol. British soldiers trusted him because he did not squander lives. British politicians defended him because he delivered results. The British public revered him because he offered certainty in a war defined by anxiety. That reverence hardened into immunity. Montgomery learned that firmness, even obstinacy, was rewarded. He learned that dissent could be overruled if presented with sufficient confidence. He learned that public narrative mattered as much as battlefield reality. And most dangerously, he learned that success validated not just his decisions, but his worldview. That worldview was shaped by scarcity. By 1942, Britain had been at war for 3 years. Its manpower pool was shrinking. Its economy was exhausted. Every infantry battalion lost could not be easily replaced. Every tank destroyed represented a meaningful strategic setback. British commanders were trained, by necessity, to value caution, preparation, and control above speed or improvisation. The Americans, by contrast, arrived with abundance. The United States entered the war with a population untouched by aerial bombardment, an industrial base operating at peacetime levels until mobilization, and a military doctrine that assumed replacement rather than conservation. American planners accepted losses as an operational cost. British planners experienced losses as an existential threat. Montgomery's caution, so admired by British troops, was inseparable from Britain's strategic predicament. But caution, when paired with moral certainty, can harden into rigidity. Montgomery did not simply believe his approach was effective, he believed it was correct. And because it had saved Britain in its darkest hour, he believed it should guide the entire Allied war effort, regardless of changing circumstances. This belief was reinforced by the structure of Allied command itself. In the early years of the alliance, Britain naturally dominated strategic planning. American forces were inexperienced. British officers had been fighting continuously since 1939. Early American defeats, particularly in North Africa, seemed to validate British assumptions about American unreadiness. Senior British commanders, such as Harold Alexander, embodied this outlook. Courteous, aristocratic, and quietly confident, Alexander viewed American forces as promising but immature. They would improve, he believed, but under British supervision. Montgomery shared this view, but expressed it without subtlety. Where Alexander managed Americans through diplomacy, Montgomery managed them through instruction. He spoke as a teacher addressing students, not as a partner addressing equals. His public statements reinforced this dynamic. His private correspondence made it explicit. To Montgomery, Americans lacked the historical experience of modern warfare. They had not endured the disasters of 1940. They had not fought for survival against a superior enemy with dwindling resources. They had arrived late to a war Britain had been fighting alone. This perspective contained a kernel of truth and a mountain of arrogance. American forces in 1942 were inexperienced. Their doctrine was evolving. Their command structure was untested. But by 1943, those conditions were changing rapidly. American units adapted quickly. American commanders learned from failure with ruthless efficiency. And American industrial output transformed theoretical capacity into operational reality. Montgomery did not adjust his assumptions accordingly. Instead, his early judgments became fixed conclusions. Each American setback confirmed his doubts. Each American success was contextualized, qualified, or minimized. Victories were attributed to material advantage rather than leadership. Failures were attributed to inexperience rather than circumstance. This interpretive bias shaped Montgomery's behavior at every level. In planning conferences, he dominated discussion. In operational debates, he framed alternatives as dangerous deviations rather than legitimate options. When challenged, he threatened resignation, a tactic that worked because British political leadership feared losing its most visible military figure. Winston Churchill, in particular, enabled Montgomery's posture. Churchill understood Montgomery's flaws. He found him difficult, vain, and inflexible. But Churchill also recognized Montgomery's symbolic value. After years of defeat, Britain could not afford to undermine its most successful general. To criticize Montgomery publicly would reopen wounds the nation could not bear. As a result, Montgomery learned that resistance carried little cost. American commanders observed this dynamic with growing frustration. They saw decisions shaped not by coalition balance or operational logic, but by the gravitational pull of Montgomery's reputation. British political considerations repeatedly outweighed American operational concerns. To American officers, men like George S. Patton and Omar Bradley, this system felt profoundly unjust. Patton, abrasive and unapologetically aggressive, viewed Montgomery as a man who confused caution with brilliance. Bradley, more restrained, saw a commander whose refusal to adapt undermined trust. Both recognized that Montgomery's authority derived not merely from rank, but from a British system that still assumed leadership by default. The imbalance was not merely cultural, it was institutional. Early Allied command arrangements placed British officers disproportionately in senior positions. Planning staffs were often overwhelmingly British. American representation increased over time, but decision-making inertia favored those already in place. Montgomery thrived in this environment. He was articulate, relentless, and supremely confident in his own judgment. He presented plans with clarity and certainty that appealed to politicians seeking reassurance. He spoke the language of command fluently, drawing on shared British assumptions about authority and expertise. American officers, by contrast, were still learning how to navigate coalition politics. They were operationally bold, but diplomatically inexperienced. They expected performance to speak for itself. They underestimated the power of narrative. Montgomery never made that mistake. He understood that wars are remembered not only through outcomes, but through explanations. He positioned himself at the center of those explanations whenever possible. When operations succeeded, he claimed clarity of vision. When they faltered, he emphasized constraints imposed by others. This pattern was not accidental. It was sustained by a system that rewarded certainty, punished dissent, and protected symbols from scrutiny. The Americans would not fully grasp this reality until they had accumulated enough power to challenge it. By the time American divisions outnumbered British forces in the field, Montgomery's habits were already entrenched. His assumptions had hardened into doctrine. His confidence had become inflexibility. The system that had sustained him, British political necessity, institutional inertia, and early wartime success, now placed him on a collision course with an alliance that had fundamentally changed. What Montgomery saw as leadership, Americans increasingly experienced as domination. What he considered professional rigor, they interpreted as condescension. What he framed as strategic prudence, they viewed as obstruction. The conflict was no longer about tactics. It was about legitimacy. And that legitimacy would be tested, not in conference rooms or press statements, but on the battlefield, where American forces would soon demonstrate that they no longer required instruction, supervision, or permission to fight. The first cracks would appear in North Africa. March 6, 1943, Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The desert wind carried the stench of burned vehicles and unburied wreckage through the narrow mountain corridors of central Tunisia. Twisted American tanks lay abandoned along wadis and rocky defiles, their crews scattered, killed, or captured. For the first time since entering the war on land against Germany, the United States Army had been struck hard and publicly. German forces under Erwin Rommel had smashed through American positions with a speed and confidence that exposed every weakness of an army still learning how to fight a modern war. Command confusion, poor coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery, and inexperienced leadership had turned a tactical setback into a humiliating rout. For the British, Kasserine confirmed what many already believed. American troops were brave. American equipment was plentiful. But American commanders, in British eyes, lacked the discipline and experience required for high-intensity combat against the Wehrmacht. The defeat was seized upon not merely as a battlefield lesson, but as institutional evidence. Within days, a report circulated through Allied headquarters, authored under the authority of Harold Alexander, now commanding all Allied ground forces in Tunisia. The assessment was blunt. American units lacked tactical cohesion. American officers lacked combat seasoning. American formations required close supervision before being entrusted with decisive roles. The report was not entirely wrong. Kasserine had revealed serious deficiencies, but what followed revealed something more corrosive. Rather than treating the defeat as a temporary failure to be corrected, British command structures treated it as a validation of permanent hierarchy. The response was not partnership, it was control. Into this wreckage stepped George S. Patton. On March the 6th, Patton arrived to assume command of the battered U.S. II Corps. What he encountered was not merely a demoralized force, but an Allied command environment that regarded American units as liabilities rather than assets. British liaison officers issued detailed instructions down to battalion level. Operational boundaries shifted without consultation. American initiatives were reviewed, revised, or vetoed by British staffs that viewed oversight as necessity. Patton understood immediately that this was not only about defeating the Germans, it was about restoring American credibility. His response was characteristically uncompromising. Discipline was enforced ruthlessly. Helmets were worn. Salutes were mandatory. Officers were ordered to lead from the front. Patton believed that appearance, behavior, and aggressiveness shaped combat effectiveness as much as doctrine. But beneath the theatrics lay a deeper objective. Patton intended to prove, to the British as much as to the Germans, that American forces could fight as equals. While Patton rebuilt two corps in the center, Bernard Montgomery advanced from the east with the British Eighth Army. Montgomery's reputation loomed over the Tunisian campaign. His victory at El Alamein had made him untouchable within British command circles. His approach, methodical, meticulously planned, and heavily resourced, stood in sharp contrast to the chaos Americans had just experienced. To Patton, Montgomery embodied everything he resented. The British Field Marshal spoke with absolute certainty, tolerated no deviation from his plans, and radiated confidence that bordered on dismissal of alternative viewpoints. In conferences, Montgomery did not debate, he instructed. His manner suggested that modern warfare was a discipline he alone had mastered. Alexander's plan for the final Tunisian offensive reflected these assumptions. Montgomery's Eighth Army would strike the main blow against the Axis defensive line at Mareth. Patton's two corps would conduct supporting operations in central Tunisia, drawing German reserves away from Montgomery's primary axis of advance. On paper, the plan made sense. Montgomery commanded veteran formations with proven success. Patton led troops recovering from defeat. But the implications went far beyond tactics. The Americans were not being asked to seize decisive objectives. They were being assigned the role of shield, absorbing enemy attention while British forces delivered victory. Credit, by implication, would flow accordingly. Patton accepted the mission, but not the premise. On March 17, 1943, Second Corps attacked toward El Ghoutar. Patton's orders emphasized aggression and coordination. Artillery was massed. Tank destroyers were positioned to exploit terrain. Infantry and armor were instructed to fight as a single system rather than independent arms. 6 days later, on March 23rd, German forces of the 10th Panzer Division launched a dawn counterattack. 50 tanks emerged from the mountain passes, advancing into what they expected would be another American collapse. Instead, they encountered a killing ground. American artillery, carefully sighted with overlapping fields of fire, unleashed devastating concentrations. Tank destroyers engaged from hull-down positions at ranges that negated German tactical advantages. Infantry held firm. By nightfall, the German assault had been broken. The battlefield was littered with destroyed armor. For the first time, American forces had defeated experienced German armored units in sustained combat. It was a turning point. It was also ignored. Alexander's headquarters remained focused on Montgomery's operations. Reports from two corps were acknowledged politely and filed away. British staff officers continued issuing instructions to Patton that implied persistent doubts about American competence. More damaging still, two corps' objectives were repeatedly altered. Advance orders were issued, then rescinded. Armor was directed forward, then told to halt. Infantry attacks were launched, then paused to accommodate British timelines. Each change disrupted American momentum and reinforced the perception that the Second Corps existed primarily to facilitate Montgomery's success. When Montgomery attacked the Mareth line on March 20th, his initial assault stalled against determined German resistance. Demonstrating flexibility, he shifted to an outflanking maneuver, a sound decision that ultimately succeeded. But the delay allowed German forces to withdraw in good order, escaping encirclement. Throughout this period, American forces continued pressing in central Tunisia. They advanced steadily, fixing German reserves and preventing their redeployment against Montgomery. Their contribution was operationally essential. It received little recognition. When Axis forces in North Africa surrendered in May 1943, approximately 250,000 German and Italian troops laid down their arms. It was a decisive Allied victory, but the narrative emphasized British achievement. Montgomery's breakthrough dominated headlines. American actions were treated as supporting context. At the victory parade in Tunis on May 20th, Allied leaders reviewed the troops. Speeches highlighted unity and success, but emphasis remained uneven. To American commanders, the message was unmistakable. They had fought, they had learned, they had won, and they were still being treated as apprentices. The lesson of Tunisia went beyond tactics. American officers learned that coalition warfare required fighting not only the enemy, but for recognition. They discovered that success did not automatically translate into respect, and they began to suspect that Montgomery's attitude was not an anomaly, but a reflection of a deeper British reluctance to accept the shifting balance of power. That suspicion would harden into certainty in the next campaign. Sicily would transform quiet resentment into open rivalry. July 10th, 1943. The Gulf of Gela, Sicily. Before dawn, the Mediterranean heaved under heavy seas as the largest amphibious operation yet attempted by the Western Allies moved toward the coast. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, was intended to crack open the Axis southern flank, remove Italy from the war, and demonstrate that the Anglo-American alliance could conduct complex, large-scale joint operations. It would do all of those things. It would also expose, beyond repair, the fault lines that had been forming since Tunisia. The plan that brought Allied forces ashore on Sicily was controversial from its inception. Early proposals called for dispersed landings across the island to seize ports quickly and prevent Axis forces from concentrating. To Bernard Montgomery, this was madness. His experience in North Africa had convinced him that dispersion invited defeat. Concentration, he insisted, was the only path to success. Montgomery proposed an alternative. All landings should occur in the southeastern corner of Sicily. From there, his Eighth Army would drive directly toward Messina, the island's northeastern gateway to mainland Italy. The American Seventh Army under George S. Patton would protect his left flank. The objections were immediate and serious. Air and naval commanders warned that Montgomery's plan would leave multiple Axis airfields operational, exposing the invasion fleet to sustained attack. The narrow concentration of shipping would increase vulnerability. Flexibility would be sacrificed for simplicity. Montgomery dismissed these concerns. When resistance persisted, he escalated. Backed by Winston Churchill, Montgomery threatened resignation rather than execute a plan he opposed. Faced with the prospect of losing Britain's most celebrated general on the eve of invasion, Dwight D. Eisenhower yielded. Montgomery's plan was adopted. The implications were unmistakable. Eighth Army would conduct the main advance. Seventh Army would guard the flank. Once again, American forces were relegated to a supporting role, not because of weakness, but because Montgomery demanded primacy. Patton read the final plan with growing anger. By mid-1943, American forces in the Mediterranean were no longer novices. Seventh Army fielded multiple divisions with growing combat experience, supported by overwhelming American air and naval power. Yet command arrangements treated them as auxiliaries to be employed at British discretion. Patton recorded his frustration privately, noting that Allied command staffs were overwhelmingly British and that decisions affecting American troops were made without American input. The imbalance was no longer tolerable. It was strategic marginalization disguised as coalition harmony. The landings themselves succeeded despite chaos. Airborne units were scattered. Many paratroopers drowned when gliders crashed into the sea. Yet by dawn, both armies held their beachheads. Italian resistance collapsed quickly. German resistance did not. Montgomery advanced north along the eastern coast, confident that Axis defenses would crumble under pressure. They did not. German paratroopers dug in south of Catania, exploiting mountainous terrain that nullified Montgomery's preference for carefully choreographed, firepower-heavy advances. As Eighth Army bogged down, Montgomery made a decision that would permanently alter Allied relations. On July 12th, he proposed expanding his operational frontage westward into territory assigned to Seventh Army. The justification was operational necessity. The effect was political domination. American forces, Montgomery suggested, should halt and defend, while British troops conducted the decisive maneuver. He did not ask. He informed. Harold Alexander, commanding Allied ground forces, approved the change without consulting Patton. On July 13th, formal orders reassigned the disputed road to Eighth Army and instructed Seventh Army to assume a defensive posture. For Patton, the message was clear. British preference would dictate Allied strategy regardless of American capability or contribution. Officially, he complied. Privately, he refused to accept irrelevance. Patton understood the political realities Eisenhower faced. Open defiance would fracture the alliance. But inactivity was unacceptable. If British command would not assign Americans a decisive mission, Patton would create one. On July 17th, Patton flew to Alexander's headquarters with a proposal. Seventh Army would drive northwest toward Palermo, Sicily's largest port. The operation would cut the island in half, trap Axis forces in the west, and secure vital logistics infrastructure. Alexander approved. The Sicily campaign transformed overnight. What had been conceived as a British advance supported by American defense became a race. Montgomery pressed slowly against German defenses in the east. Patton unleashed Seventh Army across rugged terrain at a speed that stunned both allies and enemies. American units advanced with relentless momentum. Engineers repaired roads and bridges in hours. Infantry marched through mountains under brutal heat. Supply columns improvised constantly to keep pace. Within 12 days of landing, American troops entered Palermo on July 22nd. Montgomery, still grinding south of Mount Etna, was increasingly sidelined by events. German commanders recognized the situation clearly. Sicily could not be held. The question was no longer whether the island would fall, but which Allied army would reach Messina first and claim symbolic victory. Patton intended to win that race. He drove his commanders mercilessly. Advances continued day and night. Risks were accepted that British doctrine would never have permitted. Casualties mounted, but momentum was preserved. Montgomery advanced methodically, professionally, and too slowly. On August 17, 1943, American troops entered Messina hours before British forces arrived. Seventh Army had achieved what Allied planners had never intended it to achieve. The victory should have unified the alliance. Instead, it deepened resentment. Montgomery congratulated Patton publicly, then immediately contextualized the result. Eighth Army, he implied, had faced the true German resistance. Seventh Army had advanced against weaker opposition. Terrain, not leadership, explained outcomes. British press coverage echoed the message. Eighth Army's struggle against German units dominated headlines. American advances were treated as secondary. To American commanders, the pattern was now unmistakable. When Americans failed, their inexperience was cited. When Americans succeeded, their success was explained away. Two incidents during the Sicily campaign hardened attitudes beyond repair. The first involved Patton's infamous slapping of hospitalized soldiers on August 3rd and August 10th. The incidents, when revealed, caused scandal. To Montgomery, they confirmed long-held prejudices. American commanders, he suggested privately, lacked emotional discipline. A British general would never behave so rashly. The second incident was trivial and devastating. Montgomery sent a single junior lieutenant as liaison to 7th Army headquarters. The officer arrived poorly equipped, carrying his belongings in a suitcase tied with string. Patton, who had previously dispatched a full liaison team including senior officers and communications staff, sent the lieutenant back with a note explaining that he could not permit boys at his headquarters. The insult was not accidental. Patton commanded an army equal in size to Montgomery's, yet Montgomery treated him as subordinate by default. The message was unmistakable. Parity did not exist in Montgomery's worldview. As Allied planners turned their attention toward mainland Italy and the eventual invasion of France, one conclusion had become inescapable. Montgomery viewed himself as the indispensable battlefield commander of the alliance. He expected deference from American officers regardless of their rank, experience, or achievements, and he showed no awareness or concern that this attitude was poisoning the coalition he claimed to serve. The consequences would not remain confined to Sicily. They would resurface in France, where Montgomery's ambition collided with American dominance, and they would culminate in an operation that transformed arrogance into catastrophe. Operation Market Garden. September 1st, 1944. Northern France. The German front in the west had collapsed with a speed that stunned even the most optimistic Allied planners. Following the breakout from Normandy, Allied armies surged eastward across France, liberating cities that had endured 4 years of occupation. Paris fell on August 25th. Belgian borders loomed ahead. German units retreated in disarray, abandoning equipment, supplies, and cohesion. For a brief moment, it appeared, the war in Europe might end before winter. To Bernard Montgomery, this moment demanded audacity. He had commanded all Allied ground forces during the Normandy campaign, a role that reinforced his belief that decisive victory required centralized authority. In his view, the German army was broken. What remained was to strike hard, strike deep, and end the war with a single crushing blow. But September 1st brought a change Montgomery neither welcomed nor accepted. On that day, Dwight D. Eisenhower assumed direct command of all Allied ground forces. Montgomery was returned to command of 21st Army Group, British and Canadian forces operating in Northwest Europe. American armies were reorganized under Omar Bradley, whose 12th Army Group now included the U.S. 1st, 3rd, and 9th Armies. The shift reflected reality. American forces now formed the overwhelming majority of Allied combat power. American logistics sustained the advance. American air forces dominated the skies. Political authority demanded corresponding military command. Montgomery understood the decision. He did not accept it. In private correspondence and increasingly in public statements, he argued that dispersing authority among multiple army groups diluted effectiveness. Eisenhower, he suggested, lacked battlefield experience and should limit himself to political coordination. Operational command, Montgomery insisted, belonged in the hands of a single ground commander. There was no ambiguity about who that commander should be. Montgomery's alternative strategy rejected Eisenhower's broad front advance. Instead, he proposed concentrating resources for a single thrust through northern Germany. The attack would cross the Rhine, seize the Ruhr industrial region, and drive on Berlin. American forces would support the flanks. Montgomery would command the spearhead. The proposal's military risks were substantial. A narrow thrust would create an exposed salient vulnerable to counterattack. Supply lines would stretch dangerously thin. Success depended on capturing intact bridges and assuming German resistance had collapsed beyond recovery. But the political implications were unmistakable. Montgomery was asking the United States to subordinate its armies to British command for the decisive blow of the war. Eisenhower refused outright concentration, but compromised. Montgomery was granted priority for supplies and authorized to conduct a limited operation to seize Rhine crossings in the Netherlands. The operation would use airborne forces to capture bridges, followed by a rapid ground advance. If successful, it would position Allied forces deep inside Germany. The plan was designated Operation Market Garden. American commanders were alarmed. Bradley and George S. Patton both argued that the risks outweighed potential gains. Patton's Third Army was advancing rapidly through eastern France. His forces were approaching the German border and could exploit collapsing defenses. Diverting fuel and supplies to Montgomery would slow American momentum for a gamble whose success depended on flawless execution. Their objections were noted and overruled. On September 17, 1944, Market Garden commenced. Over 35,000 American and British paratroopers dropped into the Netherlands, tasked with capturing bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. British XXX Corps advanced along a single elevated highway to relieve them. Almost immediately, the operation unraveled. Intelligence warnings about German armored units near Arnhem were dismissed. Airborne troops landed far from objectives. German resistance stiffened rapidly. The narrow highway became a choke point vulnerable to counterattack. At Arnhem, British paratroopers under John Frost held the northern bridge against overwhelming odds, waiting for relief that never came. XXX Corps was delayed repeatedly. German counterattacks severed the corridor. Airborne units were isolated, destroyed, or captured. By September 25th, the operation was abandoned. Over 17,000 Allied casualties had been suffered. The Rhine remained uncrossed. German defenses solidified. The chance to end the war in 1944 evaporated in the fields and dikes of the Netherlands. For American commanders, the failure was tragic and infuriating. They had warned against the risks. They had surrendered momentum, and now the consequences were undeniable. But what followed enraged them even more. Montgomery declared Market Garden 90% successful. The statement defied reality. The operation's sole strategic objective, establishing a bridgehead over the Rhine, had failed. Casualties were severe. No decisive advantage had been gained. Yet Montgomery reframed disaster as partial victory, emphasizing bridges taken and territory liberated. To American officers, it was a familiar maneuver. Success, however limited, was magnified. Failure, however total, was minimized. Montgomery accepted no personal responsibility. Instead, he suggested that insufficient resources and cautious execution by others had limited the operation's success. The implication was clear. Had his vision been fully supported, victory would have followed. This pattern confirmed American suspicions. Montgomery protected his reputation relentlessly. When operations succeeded, credit flowed inward. When they failed, explanations flowed outward. The most damaging episode was yet to come. December 16, 1944, the Ardennes Forest. German forces launched a surprise offensive through thinly held American lines, aiming to split Allied armies and seize Antwerp. The attack achieved initial success, creating the bulge that would give the battle its name. As the crisis deepened, Eisenhower transferred temporary command of the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies to Montgomery on December 20th. The decision that triggered Bradley's near resignation. Montgomery performed well. He stabilized defenses, secured the Meuse crossings, coordinated counterattacks, and brought order to chaos. His actions contributed meaningfully to the Allied recovery. Under genuine pressure, his competence was undeniable. But victory was won primarily by American forces. American infantry held Bastogne. American artillery shattered German attacks. Patton's Third Army executed a rapid winter counteroffensive that relieved encircled units and crushed German momentum. On January 7, 1945, Montgomery held a press conference. Ostensibly, it was meant to praise American troops and defend Eisenhower. Instead, it became an exercise in self-congratulation. Montgomery described how he had taken certain steps upon assuming command, how he had tidied up the battlefield, how his foresight ensured German forces would not cross the Meuse. American commanders were scarcely mentioned. The implication was unmistakable. American soldiers were brave, but they had been saved by British leadership. Reaction in American headquarters was explosive. Bradley, reading reports of the conference, felt betrayed. Montgomery had commanded American armies for barely 3 weeks. Those armies had fought with extraordinary courage and competence. Yet Montgomery's narrative placed himself at the center of victory. This was not merely vanity, it was historical theft. Bradley informed Eisenhower that he could no longer serve under Montgomery. If the British Field Marshal were to retain authority over American forces, Bradley would resign. Eisenhower recognized the danger immediately. Allied unity hung by a thread. Under intense pressure from both American and British leadership, Montgomery was forced to retreat. On January 12th, he issued letters expressing regret for any offense caused. The words were the right ones. The damage was irreversible. American commanders now understood with absolute clarity that Montgomery would never treat them as equals. Recognition, when it came, would always be conditional. Adaptation, when required, would always be resisted. The final reckoning lay ahead. January 1945, Western Europe. The war was no longer in doubt. German forces were retreating on every front. Allied armies pressed toward the Rhine with overwhelming superiority in manpower, firepower, and air dominance. What remained was not the question of victory, but the manner in which that victory would be concluded and remembered. For the American commanders who had fought from North Africa to the Ardennes, one conclusion had become unavoidable. Bernard Montgomery was no longer merely difficult. He was operationally dangerous to coalition warfare. By early 1945, the balance of power within the Allied alliance had shifted beyond dispute. The United States fielded over 60 divisions in Europe. Britain and Canada combined fielded fewer than 20. American factories produced the tanks, trucks, aircraft, fuel, and ammunition that sustained the Allied advance. American air forces dominated the skies from Normandy to the German border. Yet Bernard Montgomery continued to behave as though British authority should guide American strength. To Montgomery, this was not arrogance, it was conviction. He believed deeply that his approach to warfare, methodical preparation, overwhelming concentration, rigid control, was not simply effective, but morally superior. It minimized casualties. It avoided disaster. It reflected professional discipline rather than improvisation. And because it had served Britain well in its darkest hour, he believed it should remain the guiding doctrine of the alliance. What Montgomery failed to grasp was that coalition warfare is not governed solely by tactical logic. It is governed by legitimacy. American commanders no longer accepted British primacy because British experience no longer justified it. The United States was not an apprentice power learning at the feet of an imperial master. It was the dominant military force in the theater, and it expected command arrangements to reflect that reality. Montgomery could not adapt to this transformation. Even after the crisis triggered by his January 7th press conference, his fundamental outlook did not change. He issued apologies, but he did not revise assumptions. He acknowledged offense, but not error. In his private correspondence, he continued to criticize Allied strategy and to argue that the war could have ended sooner had his advice been followed. To American commanders, this confirmed what they had long suspected. Montgomery did not view coalition command as a partnership. He viewed it as a hierarchy. That hierarchy placed himself at the apex. The consequences of this mindset extended beyond personal relationships. They shaped operations, resource allocation, and strategic priorities. American advances were slowed to support British plans. Supplies were diverted to sustain Montgomery's initiatives. Risks were accepted or rejected, based not on shared judgment, but on Montgomery's certainty. After Market Garden, this behavior became intolerable. Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had spent years balancing egos and national interests, recognized that Montgomery's continued interference threatened Allied cohesion more than German resistance. Eisenhower never doubted Montgomery's tactical skill. He doubted his ability to function within a coalition of equals. The distinction mattered. Eisenhower understood that modern warfare, especially war among allies, required diplomatic sensitivity as much as operational brilliance. It required recognizing when authority must yield to consensus. It required the humility to accept that no single mind, however capable, could dominate a coalition without fracturing it. Montgomery lacked that humility. As the Allies crossed the Rhine and advanced into Germany in March 1945, Montgomery's role diminished. His 21st Army Group conducted professional, well-executed operations in northern Germany. His planning remained sound. His attention to logistics and preparation continued to produce results, but he was no longer central. American armies drove the main thrusts. American commanders dictated operational tempo. American logistics sustained momentum. Montgomery was tolerated, not trusted. Omar Bradley avoided him whenever possible. George S. Patton despised him openly. Eisenhower managed him carefully, limiting his influence while preserving the appearance of unity. This was the quiet resolution of a conflict that could no longer be allowed to escalate. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. In public, Allied leaders emphasized unity. Victory was shared. Differences were forgotten. Montgomery returned to Britain to adulation. American generals returned home to celebrations that recognized their achievements. But the bitterness did not disappear. It reemerged in memoirs, histories, and private correspondence. In 1951, Bradley published his memoirs, documenting numerous instances in which Montgomery's conduct undermined Allied cooperation. His tone was restrained, but the message was unmistakable. Montgomery's inability to treat Americans as equals had repeatedly damaged trust. Patton's diaries, published posthumously, revealed raw contempt. He described Montgomery as arrogant, self-promoting, and strategically limited. The diaries confirmed what many American officers had believed, but rarely said publicly during the war. Montgomery, for his part, did not retreat into silence. In 1958, his own memoirs reignited controversy by criticizing Eisenhower's leadership and implicitly arguing that Montgomery's strategic vision had been superior. The response was swift and final. Eisenhower, by then President of the United States, broke off personal contact. He refused to engage in public debate with a former colleague who seemed determined to relitigate a war already won. The historical debate that followed would last for decades. British historians defended Montgomery as a brilliant commander constrained by coalition politics and misunderstood by Americans who favored speed over prudence. They emphasized that Montgomery never lost a major battle after assuming command in North Africa. They credited his planning with the success of D-Day and the steady destruction of German forces. American historians countered that Montgomery's caution often allowed enemies to escape, that his insistence on control slowed Allied momentum, and that his personality created unnecessary friction. They argued that American commanders had demonstrated operational brilliance equal to Montgomery's, and that the British field marshal's refusal to acknowledge this reflected cultural prejudice rather than military reality. Both sides were partly correct. Montgomery was a gifted tactician. His concern for casualties was genuine. His preparation was meticulous. He provided Britain with leadership when it desperately needed confidence. But coalition warfare demands more than tactical skill. It demands respect. It demands the ability to recognize when historical precedence has given way to present reality. It demands an understanding that allies are not subordinates, and that leadership must evolve with circumstance. Montgomery never made that transition. For the Americans who fought alongside him, the issue was never national rivalry. It was dignity. They did not resent British caution. They resented British condescension. They did not deny Montgomery's talent. They rejected his assumption of superiority. In their eyes, Montgomery represented something they believed they had left behind in 1776. The belief that British judgment must guide American power, that New World energy required Old World wisdom to succeed, that initiative without pedigree was inherently suspect. They discovered, through hard experience, that battlefield excellence and industrial might could overcome any enemy, but not entrenched assumptions. The legacy of this conflict outlived the war itself. Post-war coalition structures were designed with these lessons in mind. Command arrangements emphasized proportional representation. Political oversight constrained individual dominance. No single personality would again be allowed to shape coalition strategy unchecked. The Americans had learned, painfully, that alliances are fragile structures. They survive not on shared enemies alone, but on mutual recognition. Bernard Montgomery never accepted this conclusion. Until his death in 1976, he maintained that his wartime conduct had been appropriate, his criticisms justified, his vision superior. He remained convinced that the war could have ended sooner had his advice been followed. American commanders who survived him offered a different verdict. They acknowledged his skill. They respected his victories, but they concluded, nearly unanimously, that his inability to function as an equal partner made him a liability in coalition warfare. The final assessment belonged to Eisenhower. Writing years after the war, he noted Montgomery's undeniable military talents, but also his complete inability to understand the political dimensions of coalition command. In that failure, Eisenhower implied, lay the limits of Montgomery's greatness. In wars fought alone, brilliance may suffice. In wars fought together, it is not enough. And in that truth lies the answer to a question that haunted American commanders from North Africa to Germany. They did not hate Montgomery because he was British. They did not hate him because he was cautious. They hated him because he never treated them as equals, because he demanded their blood, but not their judgment, because he accepted their strength, but not their legitimacy, because he fought a coalition war as though it were still an empire's campaign. That failure of imagination, more than any battlefield decision, ensured that Bernard Montgomery would be remembered not only as a brilliant commander, but as a cautionary tale.